Silas Vane didn't even look at them when he spoke. That was the part Mara Ellison would never forget. Not the crowd, not the wooden platform beneath her feet, not even the cold morning air biting through her dead father's coat. What she would carry with her the rest of her life was the way Silas Vane stood with his back half turned, talking to the man beside him like she and her 12-year-old brother were livestock he hadn't decided whether to bother with yet. "What's the opening on the girl?" he said. "Not what's she worth. Not even what can she do. Just the girl. Like she was a fence post, like she was a number on a ledger." Eli pressed closer to her side. She could feel him shaking. If you were standing on that wagon in her place, no money, no family left, no deed to your name, what would you have done? This is the story of Mara Ellison, the woman they tried to sell, the woman no one could break. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you long after you've heard it. If this story reaches you today, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this woman's story has traveled. The morning it all ended started the same way every bad morning starts. Too quiet. Mara was up before the sun, the way she'd been since she was 8 years old, and her mother was still alive to tell her that the day didn't wait for people who slept through it. She'd pulled on her boots, her father's boots, 2 sizes too large, stuffed with cloth at the toes, and walked out to check on the horses. That was her job, had been her job for 3 years, ever since Thomas Ellison's hands started shaking bad enough that he couldn't trust himself with the bridles. The horses were gone, all 4 of them. The stalls standing open, ropes cut clean, no mud disturbed outside the gate. She stood there in the gray half-light staring at 4 empty stalls for longer than she should have. Her mind kept trying to make it mean something other than what it meant. Maybe they'd gotten loose. Maybe she'd left the gate unlatched the night before. Maybe she'd missed something. She walked the perimeter of the fence twice. She checked the latch. She looked down at the rope ends, at the clean cuts. Someone had come in the night. Someone who knew what they were doing. She walked back inside to wake her father and found the sheriff sitting at the kitchen table. His name was Dale Pruitt, and he had the look of a man who'd practiced being sorry so many times that the word had worn smooth and meant nothing anymore. He held his hat in his hands. He'd helped himself to a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. He did not stand when she came in. "Mara," he said, "where's my father?" It wasn't a question. She already knew, the way you know things your body understands before your mind will allow it. She'd walked past the bedroom door, and it was open, and the bed was made. "He passed in the night," Pruitt said. "Mrs. Hollis found him at first light when she came to check on him. She's the one sent for me." Mara set her hand flat on the door frame. The wood was cold. "Where is he now?" "They took him over to Calhoun's. It was the right thing, Mara. He was already—" "I didn't ask you if it was the right thing." Pruitt cleared his throat. He turned his hat in his hands. "There's some business we need to discuss. You and your brother, when Eli wakes up." "What business?" He set a folded paper on the table. She already knew what it was. She'd seen papers like that before, when the Farrow family lost their place 3 years back, and the Hendersons before them. Papers with numbers on them that didn't match anything in the real world, stamped with seals that meant they came from somewhere you couldn't argue with. She didn't touch it. "Your father had a debt with First Territorial," Pruitt said. "Going back 4 years. There were arrangements made, but with his passing—" "He made arrangements. I know about the arrangements. He spoke to Harlan Geddes at the bank personally. There was an extension. The extension lapsed." "When?" Pruitt looked at his coffee. 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, her father had been awake and lucid for the first time in months, sitting up in his bed, laughing at something Eli had said about a rooster. 2 weeks ago, he'd told her things were going to be all right. He'd said he'd take care of it. "He didn't know," she said. She wasn't saying it to Pruitt. She was saying it to the room, to the walls of the house she'd grown up in. "The bank has already initiated proceedings," Pruitt said. "The property and all assets, including livestock, revert to First Territorial as of this morning." The horses. There it was. They hadn't gotten loose. "They came and took the horses last night," she said, "while my father was dying." Pruitt didn't answer. Look at me when I'm talking to you." He looked up. He had the decency, at least, to look uncomfortable. "They came onto this property and took our horses while my father was dying in that bedroom," she said. "And you sat here and drank our coffee and waited for me to wake up so you could tell me. Mara, get out of this house. I understand you're upset. I am not upset." Her voice was very steady. She'd learned that from her mother. The particular kind of stillness that came not from calm but from deciding that you were not going to give a room full of people the satisfaction of watching you fall apart. "I am standing in my kitchen telling you to leave. Take your paper with you. I'll come to the bank myself." He left the paper on the table when he went. She waited until she heard the door close behind him, and then she sat down in her father's chair and put her face in her hands and let herself have 30 seconds. She counted them out loud in her head, 1 through 30, and when she got there, she lifted her head and wiped her face with her sleeve and stood up. Then she went to wake Eli. He was 12, but he looked younger when he was asleep. Something about the way his face went slack, all that scrappy toughness he wore during the day just gone. She sat on the edge of his cot and she told him plainly and quietly, the way her father had always delivered hard news, without wrapping it in so much softness that the truth got lost. Eli didn't cry right away. He sat up and he stared at the wall for a long moment, and then he said, "What are we going to do?" "We're going to figure it out," she said. "That's all I can tell you right now." "But the ranch, I know?" "Papa always said, 'I know, Eli.'" She put her hand on the back of his neck the way their mother used to. "Get dressed. We need to go into town." The bank was a 2-story building on Red Hollow's main street with curtains in the upper windows that always struck Mara as trying too hard. Harlan Geddes kept his office upstairs, which meant you had to walk past the tellers and the clerks and everyone watching to find out what trouble had come in that morning. Mara walked up those stairs with Eli behind her, and she did not look at anyone. Geddes was a narrow man who'd always reminded her of something that lived under a rock, pale and quick-eyed, moving too fast, stopping very suddenly. He smiled when she came in, which was the first sign that whatever happened next was already decided. "Miss Ellison," he said, "I heard about your father. I'm very sorry." "I want to see the extension agreement," she said. "The one my father signed 4 months ago." Geddes folded his hands on his desk. "There was no extension agreement. I was in this room when he signed it. You were sitting in that chair. What you may be remembering was a preliminary conversation. Nothing was formalized. We discussed the possibility of an extension, but the board declined to approve it. You told him it was approved." "I told him we would make every effort." Geddes tilted his head slightly. "I'm sorry if there was a miscommunication." Mara looked at him for a long moment. "You told a man who was dying that his family's land was safe," she said, "and you let him die thinking that." Something moved in Geddes's eyes. Not shame. Something more like a calculation, checking to see how much this moment was going to cost him. "The debt is legitimate," he said. "The terms are in order. I'm afraid there's nothing I can do." "How much?" she said. "How much to clear it?" "Miss Ellison, how much?" He told her a number. It was a number that might as well have been the distance to the moon. She stood up. She took Eli by the shoulder. She walked out of Harlan Geddes's office and down the stairs and out into the morning sun, and she stood on the boardwalk of Red Hollow's main street, and she tried to think. Eli said nothing. He stood beside her and waited, and that patience, that trust that she would come up with something, was almost harder to carry than the number Geddes had just given her. She spent the next 3 days in motion. She went to every ranch family she knew, hat in hand, asking quietly if anyone might take on some work, if anyone knew of a way. She got sympathy in abundance. Actual help was in shorter supply. The Kellermans offered Eli a temporary spot helping with their stock, which she was grateful for and which she hated to need. Old Mrs. Hart gave her a jar of preserves and told her to keep her chin up, which was not precisely useful. On the 3rd day, the notice went up in the center of town. She saw it from across the street, a posted paper on the board outside the feed store, the kind used for livestock sales and property foreclosures. She crossed the street and read it once and then stood very still. Public auction. The estate of Thomas Ellison, deceased, including all remaining goods and chattel. The notice used the word chattel. That was the word. Goods and chattel. Eli's name was on it, So was hers. She read it 3 times to make sure she understood what she was reading. Wyoming Territory had laws. She knew it did. She'd heard about them. But laws were one thing, and what was actually happening in Red Hollow was another. And what was happening in Red Hollow was that Harlan Geddes had signed a paper, and the bank had filed something with the county. And somehow, somewhere between her father's death and this piece of paper, she and her 12-year-old brother had become assets in a liquidation. She pulled the notice off the board and walked directly to Pruitt's office. He was at his desk, and when she came in and set the paper in front of him, he looked at it the way a man looks at something he already knew was coming. "This isn't legal," she said. "It's complicated," he said. "Don't tell me it's complicated. Tell me why my name is on an auction notice." Pruitt rubbed the back of his neck. He had the look of a man who wanted very much to be somewhere else. "The bank has a claim on assets of the estate. Your father signed an agreement years back that I'm not an asset, I'm a person. Mara, I am 21 years old, I am not property." "Nobody's calling you property." But he wouldn't hold her eyes. "What it is, it's a labor contract situation. The bank holds the right to assign outstanding labor obligations as part of the debt settlement. It's been done before. It's—" He stopped. "It's what Silas Vane asked for," she said. Pruitt said nothing. "He asked Geddes to write it this way," she said. "He's done it before, hasn't he? This isn't the first time." "I can't speak to any of that." "No," she said. "I don't expect you can." She left his office and went back to the Kellerman place where Eli was staying, and she sat in the barn, and she let herself think about Silas Vane. She'd seen him around town her whole life. Big man, careful dresser, always with 2 or 3 men around him who were not exactly employees and not exactly friends. He had the largest cattle operation in the valley, and he'd had it for 20 years, and every time another family sold off their land or left the territory, Silas Vane's holdings got a little bigger. He was not a man who made enemies exactly. He was a man who made situations where the other person had no good choices. She thought about running. She thought about it seriously, lying in the dark of the Kellerman barn with the smell of straw and horses around her, working it through. She and Eli could go north. She knew people in Casper. Maybe they could... But she knew how that ended. She'd seen it. You ran with nothing. You arrived with nothing. And then you were nothing in a new place, which was the same as being nothing in the old place except colder. She stopped thinking about running. The morning of the auction was overcast, the sky the color of old tin. Red Hollow's main square had a wooden platform built in the center of it that served multiple purposes. Announcements, occasional performances, and when Harlan Geddes had an estate to liquidate, this. The platform was maybe 3 feet off the ground, high enough to be seen. Mara dressed carefully. She wore her father's coat, the good one he'd saved for occasions. She braided her hair. She did all of this deliberately, the way she did everything. Not because it would matter to the crowd, but because it mattered to her. She was not going to stand on that platform looking like someone who'd been beaten. She took Eli's hand when they walked into the square. He was trying very hard not to show how frightened he was, and the trying was evident in every line of his 12-year-old face, the jaw set too tight, the eyes a little too wide. "Look straight ahead," she told him. "Don't look at them." "Mara, I know," she said. "Me too. Look straight ahead." There were maybe 40 people in the square. She recognized most of them. She'd grown up with their children, attended the same services, bought flour from the same store. They stood in a rough semicircle around the platform, and not one of them met her eyes as she climbed the steps. Geddes read the terms from a paper. She didn't listen. She watched the crowd. Some of them looked uncomfortable. Most of them looked at their feet or at the middle distance. A few looked genuinely curious, the way people look at things that are unfortunate but also interesting. Silas Vane stood at the front of the crowd with his hands clasped behind his back. He was wearing a good coat and a clean hat, and he was looking at her with the specific quality of attention a man gives to something he's already decided to buy. Not hunger exactly, more like inventory assessment. He hadn't turned to face her when she climbed up. He turned slowly, at his own pace, and he looked at her the way she'd look at a horse she was considering, useful or not useful, sound or not sound. Then he half turned to the man beside him and said something, and the man beside him wrote something down. "What's the opening on the girl?" he said. Not a question to the crowd, a question to Geddes. Like she couldn't hear him, like she wasn't standing 8 feet away in the cold morning air. She felt Eli's hand tighten around hers. She had held herself together for 5 days. She had sat in a bank office and been lied to, and she had read her own name on an auction notice, and she had spent a night in a barn planning escapes. She knew wouldn't work, and she had dressed carefully this morning and walked into the square holding her brother's hand, and she had held herself together through all of it. She was still holding herself together, but standing there, listening to Silas Vane use the word girl in that particular flat voice, she felt something change in her chest. Not break. She would not describe it as breaking. Something more like solidifying, like water turning to stone. Geddes called for bids. There was an opening number. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The crowd stood in its semicircle with its eyes slightly averted, and Mara understood suddenly with perfect clarity that not one of them was going to say a word. Not one of them was going to object or intervene or do anything other than stand there and watch it happen. Silas raised his hand and offered a number. His voice was relaxed, pleasant, the voice of a man completing a routine transaction. Still, nobody moved. And then, from the back of the crowd, so far back she couldn't see who'd spoken, couldn't place the voice in the general noise of wind and horses and her own heartbeat, someone said, $500. The crowd went so quiet she could hear a horse shifting its weight somewhere behind her. Silas Vane turned around very slowly. She looked out over the heads of 40 people trying to see who had just done something that nobody in Red Hollow did. Nobody outbid Silas Vane. That wasn't how it worked here. That wasn't how it had worked in years. The crowd parted. Not all at once. It happened the way crowds always part, grudgingly, people stepping back without quite realizing they were doing it. And from the back of the square, moving through the space the crowd was making, came a man she'd seen before but never spoken to. He was tall, which was the first thing. Not imposing tall, just genuinely tall, with the kind of build that came from actual work, rather than any kind of deliberate effort. His coat was clean but not new. He walked like someone who was used to having space around him, unhurried, not performing anything for anybody. He had a jaw that looked like it had been in at least one fight, and a pair of dark eyes that were currently fixed on Silas Vane with an expression that was not exactly hostility, but was several things that lived in the same neighborhood. His name was Gideon Cross. She knew the name the way everyone in the valley knew it, as a set of associated facts rather than a person. Rancher, worked the northern land above the ridge, had bought the property 6 years back from the Waltham estate and had been there alone ever since, kept to himself, caused no trouble. People said things about him the way they say things about anyone who doesn't explain himself. Dangerous, difficult, probably hiding something. She'd always dismissed most of it, the way she dismissed most of what people said about men who didn't perform their normalcy loudly enough. He stopped at the edge of the platform and looked up at her. Not at Geddes. Not at Vane. At her. 550, Silas said behind her. Still pleasant, still relaxed. 800, Gideon Cross said. He didn't look away from her. Silas's voice dropped to something slightly different in register. 1,000. 1,500. The number sat in the air of the square. She heard someone inhale. $1,500 was not a number you threw around in a place like Red Hollow, not on a Tuesday morning, not over something like this. Silas Vane was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and walked away through the crowd, people stepping aside for him quickly, almost automatically, without him having to ask. He didn't look back. Geddes cleared his throat. He called the sale. He said things with papers. Mara stood on the platform and looked at Gideon Cross, who was still looking at her. He didn't look satisfied. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look like a man who'd just purchased something. He looked, if anything, like a man who was slightly irritated that this had been necessary. "You can come down now," he said. "If you want to." If you want to. She noticed that. She noticed it carefully. Eli's hand was still in hers. She held it as she walked down the platform steps. 3 steps, which she took without looking at the crowd, without looking at Geddes, without looking at anyone except Gideon Cross, who stepped back slightly when she reached the ground to give her room. "What do you want?" she said, keeping her voice low so only he could hear. "Nothing that's not offered," he said. "Nobody spends $1,500 for nothing." "I didn't say for nothing." He glanced at Eli, then back at her. "I said nothing that's not offered." She studied him. She was good at reading people. Had learned it young, the way children of struggling families do, picking up the slight hesitations and the small evasions that meant someone was about to let you down. She looked at this man, and she could not find the angle. That bothered her more than a clear angle would have. "I want to know why," she said. "Not here," he said quietly. "This isn't the place." She looked around the square. 40 people, now moving again, talking in low voices, stealing glances. She saw 2 of Silas Vane's men near the feed store, watching. She looked back at Gideon Cross. "We're not going to belong to you," she said. "I need you to know that before we go anywhere." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I bought a debt," he said. "Not people." A lot of men would say the same thing and mean something different. "A lot of men would," he agreed. He said it simply, without offense, in the tone of someone acknowledging a true thing. She had maybe 3 seconds to make a decision. She had 40 people around her, a bank that had already proven it would do whatever Harlan Geddes and Silas Vane needed it to do, and a 12-year-old boy holding her hand who was keeping his face very still in the particular way that meant he was trying not to cry in public. She had one other thing, too, the $1,500 and the way this man had offered it. Not looking at Vane when he said the numbers, not performing anything for the crowd, looking at her. "All right," she said. They walked out of Red Hollow's main square together. The tall man with the not-new coat, the young woman in her dead father's boots, and the 12-year-old boy trying to keep his chin level, while 40 people watched and said nothing, and Harlan Geddes folded his papers, and Silas Vane's men watched from the doorway of the feed store, and the sky above it all stayed the color of old tin. She didn't look back. She had learned something that morning, standing on that platform, listening to Silas Vane say the girl in that flat, uninterested voice. She had learned it in her chest before she could have put words to it, but now, walking north out of town, Eli's hand still in hers, she found the words. The worst thing they could do to her had already happened. They had put her on a platform and tried to sell her future for a debt she didn't make, and they had done it in front of everyone she knew, and she was still here, still walking, still thinking. The worst thing they could do had already happened, and she was still standing. She thought about her father's boots, 2 sizes too large, stuffed with cloth at the toes. Her feet had blistered in them at first. She'd learned to walk differently, a little wider, a little more deliberate, and eventually she'd stopped noticing they weren't hers. Maybe that was most of what survival was. Not finding something that fit, but learning a different way to walk. The road north out of Red Hollow was unpaved, pale with frost at the edges, running straight for about a mile before it bent around a low hill and the town disappeared from view. When they reached that bend, Eli finally spoke. "Are we going to be okay?" he asked. He was looking at her, not at the man walking 10 feet ahead of them. She didn't answer right away. She'd made herself a rule early on, sometime in that long night in the Kellerman barn. She would not lie to Eli about the hard things. She'd seen what false comfort did to people, watched her father accept reassurances from Geddes that had cost them everything. "I don't know yet," she said. Eli absorbed this. Then he nodded, once, with a seriousness that shouldn't have fit on a 12-year-old's face, and somehow did. Ahead of them, Gideon Cross walked at a pace that was neither hurrying them nor leaving them behind. The pace of a man who had decided to go somewhere and expected, without making a demand of it, that they might come along. She watched him walk. She still didn't know what he wanted. She still couldn't find the angle. But she knew what she wanted, and she knew what she was capable of. And she had learned that morning that they could take everything from her, the land, the horses, her father, her name on an auction board. And she would still be standing when they were done. So she walked, one step and then another in her dead father's boots, on a frost-pale road, toward a ridge she'd never crossed and a ranch she'd never seen, into whatever came next. The ranch came into view about 2 miles past the ridge, and Mara's first thought was that it looked like something that had been in a long argument with the weather and was losing. Not collapsed. That would have been easier to assess. It was more that everything on the property had reached a particular stage of deterioration that suggested neglect rather than disaster. The main house stood solid enough, its bones good, but the porch railing had gone missing on the left side and the shutters on two windows hung at angles that served no practical purpose. The barn was large and structurally sound and badly in need of paint that had given up sometime around 1871 by the look of it. Three of the fence posts along the south line leaned at angles that would let cattle through without much effort from the cattle. She did not say any of this. She walked the property with her eyes and catalogued it the way her father had taught her. Not what it looked like, but what it needed, in order of urgency, and how much each thing would cost in time and material. Gideon Cross had stopped in the yard and was watching her do this. She was aware of him watching. "It's not much," he said. "It's something," she said. "That's more than we had this morning." Eli had stopped beside her and was looking at the barn with an expression she recognized, the particular interest of a boy who was already thinking about what was inside. "Can I look at the horses?" he asked. Gideon glanced at him. "There's two, bay gelding and a roan mare. The gelding bites if you come at him from the left." "Why from the left?" "Don't know. He just does." Eli looked at her. She gave him a slight nod and he was gone across the yard at a pace that was technically not running. She and Gideon Cross stood in the silence of the yard. A wind came off the ridge and moved through the dry grass and went somewhere else. A shutter knocked once against the side of the house. "You gonna tell me now?" she said. He looked at her. "Tell you what? Why you were at that auction. Why you spent $1,500 you didn't have to spend. You don't know me. My father wasn't your neighbor, so either this is something to do with Silas Vane, or it's something to do with me, and I'd like to know which one before I spend another hour on your property." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Both. Start with Vane." He walked toward the house. She followed, not because she'd been invited, but because the conversation seemed to be going in that direction. Inside, the kitchen was cleaner than she'd expected. The floor was swept. There were no dishes left out. It was the kitchen of someone who lived alone and had reduced his habits to the minimum required to function. Nothing extra, nothing decorative, nothing that suggested any particular interest in how the space felt. He put a pot on the stove without asking her if she wanted coffee, which she took as practical rather than rude. "I've been watching Vane take this valley apart for 4 years, he said. He had his back to her, working the stove. Family by family, ranch by ranch, always through the bank, always through Getty's, always with papers that look legal until you get a lawyer to read them, and by then the family's already gone." "You got a lawyer to read papers?" "Once." He said it flatly, in a tone that closed the subject somewhat, but not entirely. "What happened?" "He left the territory." He turned and set 2 cups on the table. 3 days after he told me what he'd found. She looked at him. "I'm not saying Vane ran him off," Gideon said, sitting down. "I'm saying he left and I never found another one willing to look." She sat down across from him. The coffee was strong enough to constitute a solid. She drank it without comment. "So you've been watching him do this for 4 years, and you've been, what, waiting? Trying to find a way that doesn't end with me losing this place too. You're on the list." "I've been on the list since year 2. He wants the northern land because the ridge property has access to the Catlet Spring. I've been blocking it just by being here." She understood what he hadn't said yet. "He was going to use us to get to you. If he'd gotten a labor contract over the 2 of you, I'd have had Vane's people on the road between here and town every day, watching the property, counting my cattle, looking for anything they could use." He drank his coffee. "He's done it to others. Get a hold on someone connected to a property he wants and work outward from there." "So you stopped him?" "I slowed him down." He set his cup down. "There's a difference." She thought about that. She thought about the way he'd said it, not correcting her exactly, just being precise. There was something in him that was very committed to the exact truth of things, even when the exact truth was less comforting than the approximate version. "You said it was both," she said. "Vane and me." He looked at her for a moment. "Your father built that ranch from nothing," he said. 15 years ago there was nothing on that land but scrub and bad grass. I watched him do it, watched what it took." He paused. I knew what Vane was going to do with the two of you, and I didn't want to watch that too. It was not a romantic statement. He said it the same way he said everything, plainly and with no decoration. She found, unexpectedly, that this made it land harder than something more elaborate would have. She looked down at the table. I'm going to work, she said. I need you to understand that from the start. I'm not here to be taken care of. I need a place to stay and I need time to figure out what comes next. But while I'm here, I'll carry my weight and more if the work is there to do. There's work. What's the operation? 60 head. Some of them mine, some contracted from the Heller family 2 valleys over. I run them on the north pasture in summer, pull them down before the passes close. I've been doing it with seasonal hands, but I lost my last 2 last spring. One went to Colorado, one got hurt. She looked at the list of things she'd already noted. The fences, the shutter, the barn. Your fence line on the south side is going to lose you cattle before the month is out. He looked at her without speaking. 3 posts down near the creek bend, she said. I saw it when we came in. I know about the fence. Then you know it's more urgent than it looks from here. She set her cup down. I can start on it tomorrow if you show me where you keep the tools. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly. More like a recalibration. The look of someone updating a calculation they'd already run. Tool sheds behind the barn, he said. The first 2 weeks were not easy, and she would not have described them as anything other than exactly what they were, a sustained exercise in mutual adjustment between people who had no established language for each other yet. Gideon Cross was not unkind, but he was also not practiced in the presence of other people, and it showed in the small constant ways that privacy, kept too long, tends to show. He left doors open or closed without apparent logic. He ate at irregular hours and seemed surprised, in a mild way, when other people required meals at predictable times. He was capable of complete silence for so long that she sometimes checked to confirm he was still in the room, and then when he did speak, it was usually to the point of being startling. She adapted. She'd been adapting her whole life. Eli was the easier problem, because Eli was 12, and 12-year-olds adapt the way water adapts, finding the available shape of a thing and filling it. By the end of the 3rd day, he'd established a relationship with the bay gelding that included an apparent détente regarding the left side biting issue. By the end of the week, he was waking before Mara did to help with the morning feeding, which was not something she'd asked him to do, and which moved her in a way she didn't entirely examine. She fixed the south fence in 3 days, working from first light until the light was gone. On the 2nd day, Gideon came and worked beside her without saying he was going to do this. He just appeared with a post driver and the second coil of wire she would have needed to ask for, and they worked in near silence for 6 hours with the particular efficiency of people who both knew what they were doing. They got through twice what she would have done alone. She didn't thank him for it. She thought, accurately, that he would find this more comfortable than being thanked. On the 4th day, she found the ledgers. She'd been looking for the inventory records. She needed to know the actual count of cattle, not the number he'd told her, because the number people told her and the number that was real were in her experience 2 different things that sometimes were the same. She found the ledgers in a wooden box in the back room that served as an office, and she sat down with them and opened the first one and within about 4 pages understood something she hadn't expected. Gideon Cross was not struggling because he was bad at ranching. He was struggling because something upstream of the ranching was going wrong, and he either didn't know it or knew it and hadn't been able to address it. She went through 3 years of records. It took her the rest of that day and most of the evening. At dinner, a meal she had taken over preparing not as a domestic arrangement, but because Gideon's approach to cooking was functional in the same way that a closed fist is functional as a tool, technically useful but leaving a lot to be desired, she put the ledger on the table. "You've been overcharged on your contracted cattle," she said. He looked at the ledger. "What do you mean?" "The Heller family. You're paying them a contracted rate per head, but the rate in this ledger is higher than what they filed with the county last year. I checked the posted rates in the back pages." She pointed. "You're overpaying by about 11 cents per head per month." "That's not—" He stopped. "On 60 head over 3 years, that's—" "I can do arithmetic," he said. "I know. I'm telling you because I don't know if you knew." He stared at the page. His jaw did something. "I didn't know." he said, in a tone that indicated he wasn't certain whether to direct his feelings at himself or at the Heller family. It may be an error, she said. It may not be. But you should talk to them. I'll talk to them. She picked the ledger back up. There's more. Your seasonal hands were being paid from a different account than your operational costs, which means your actual operating margin looks better than it is on paper. If anyone looks at these books to assess the ranch's value, Vane's people, he said. Anyone, she said. If anyone looks at these books, they'll see a number that doesn't reflect what this place actually costs to run. He was quiet for a long moment, then, how do you know all this? My father, she said. He was bad at keeping records. I got good at reading them. She did not say the rest of it, that she had spent years of her life watching a man she loved make small mistakes that added up to large ones, that she had learned the shape of financial trouble the way a person who's nearly drowned learns to read water. She didn't say it because it wasn't relevant to the ledger, and because she wasn't ready to give that particular thing to someone she'd known 2 weeks. But she thought Gideon Cross, looking at her across the table, understood something of it anyway. The Heller situation became the first real conflict. She rode with Gideon to the Heller Ranch 10 days after she'd found the ledger, and the Heller Ranch was a straightforward operation run by a man named Walt Heller, who had a handshake like a piece of farm equipment and eyes that moved a lot faster than the rest of his presentation suggested they should. Gideon brought up the rate discrepancy plainly and without accusation. She noted how he did it, the particular neutral tone, putting the numbers on the table as a thing to be understood rather than a thing to be argued about. Walt Heller looked at the figures and said there must have been a misunderstanding and he'd make it right, all in the same pleasant tone, but his eyes went to Mara twice while he was saying it. On the ride back, Gideon said nothing for a long time. He knew, he said, eventually. Yes. He wasn't going to say anything about it. No. Another silence. The road went through a stand of cottonwoods and came out the other side, and the ridge was visible ahead of them, the catlit spring somewhere up in that country, invisible from here but present, the way important things sometimes are. Heller's been with Vane, he said. It wasn't a question. I don't know that. What I know is that he was overcharging you, and he wasn't planning to stop. She looked at the ridge. Whether Vane asked him to or he thought of it himself doesn't change what he was doing. Gideon's horse took a step sideways on a loose patch of gravel, and he corrected it without looking down. If Heller's been reporting back to Vane, then Vane has 3 years of your books. And he knows the margin. He knows a margin that's better than it is, she said, because of the way you were accounting for the hands. He looked at her. Which means if he's been using that number to plan anything, he may have been planning around wrong information, she said. Something moved in Gideon's expression that she hadn't seen before, a kind of slow, complicated process that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite calculation, but sat somewhere between them. You found that in 2 weeks, he said. I found it in 1 day. It took me another 2 weeks to understand what it meant. He looked back at the road. Your father was a fool, he said, and then stopped, and stopped very deliberately. I'm sorry, he was, she said, not a fool about ranching, about people. He trusted whoever seemed trustworthy because he wanted there to be trustworthy people. She thought about Harlan Geddes and the extension that had never been formalized, and her father dying in his bedroom thinking his children's future was safe. It cost him everything. It cost most people something, Gideon said. The ones it costs everything are just the ones who couldn't afford it. He didn't have anything to say to that, and she wasn't looking for a response. They rode the rest of the way back in the kind of silence that had changed shape over the 2 weeks. No longer the silence of people who didn't know how to exist near each other, but something more like the silence of people who were beginning to understand that they didn't need to fill every space with noise. The next crisis came from a direction she hadn't watched. It came from town, in the form of a man named Royce Draper, who rode onto the property on a Wednesday with a leather satchel and the slightly too clean appearance of someone who worked somewhere dry and indoors. He said he was from First Territorial Bank, which was how she knew before he opened his mouth again that this was going to be a problem. He had a document. He presented it to Gideon with the professional cordiality of someone who had practiced presenting bad news in a tone that made it sound like a courtesy. It was a reassessment notice. The ranch, the land, the cattle, the water access rights had been reassessed by the county at a new value. The new value triggered a clause in Gideon's original property loan that required a partial payment within 60 days to maintain the loan's current terms. She read it over Gideon's shoulder. Then she read it again. "Who ordered the reassessment?" she said. Draper looked at her. He had the specific quality of surprise of a man who had expected to deal with one person and found two. "The county assessor's office conducts regular—" "The last reassessment on this property was 14 months ago," she said. "It's in the loan documentation." She'd read the loan documentation because she'd read everything in the back room. What triggered a new one? "I'm not in a position to speak to the county's—" "When did Silas Vane file the request?" Draper went still for just a fraction of a second, just enough. "You can leave," Gideon said. "Mr. Cross, I want to be clear that this is a legal process. I know it's a legal process." Gideon's voice had not changed in volume or temperature. It had just become very exact. "I said you can leave." After Draper in his clean coat and his leather satchel were gone back down the road, Gideon stood in the yard holding the reassessment notice, and Mara stood beside him, and they both looked at the paper and neither of them said the obvious thing for a moment, because the obvious thing was sitting right there without needing to be said. 60 days. "What's the number?" she said. He told her. She thought about the ledgers. She thought about the actual operating margin versus the paper margin. She thought about whether there was a path from here to that number in 60 days by any route that was real rather than theoretical. "Gideon, I know. We need more than what the cattle bring. I know." "The spring," she said. He looked at her. "The catlit spring. You have access rights that no other ranch in the valley has." She turned toward the ridge. "Vane has been trying to get this property for 2 years because of that water, which means other people also need that water." She looked back at him. "Have you ever offered it to anyone else?" He stared at her. "Offered what to anyone else?" "Access. A water agreement. A share of the spring's output in exchange for, 'This is my property.' I know it is. I'm asking if you've ever used that as an asset instead of just defending it." He was quiet for a long time. The shutter that she still hadn't gotten around to fixing knocked against the house. Somewhere over the ridge, the spring she'd never seen was doing whatever it was doing, running downhill toward the valley. This whole disputed, fought-over thing, just water moving through rock the way water did without caring about any of them. "No," he said. "I never offered it to anyone." "Then Vane has been the only one who wanted it," she said. "And you've been defending against him alone." She kept her eyes on him. "You don't have to defend alone." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see the thing in him that resisted it. Whatever it was that had kept him up here past the ridge for 6 years, alone in a clean kitchen with irregular meals and a biting gelding and nobody he trusted. "The other families in the valley," she said. "How many of them has Vane squeezed in the last 4 years?" "6 that I know of. 3 still have their land." 3 families who still have their land and who have a very clear idea of what Vane does to people he gets his hands on. She let that sit for a second. And who might be very interested in a water arrangement that doesn't go through Silas Vane? Something moved across Gideon's face that she didn't have a full name for yet. It was something between reluctance and a particular kind of recognition, the look of someone who's been walking in a circle and has just seen, from a slightly different angle, that it's been a circle. "You've been thinking about this," he said, "since Draper left the yard." "That was 20 minutes ago." "I know. I work fast when I'm angry." She picked up the reassessment notice from where he'd set it on the fence post. "This is what Vane wanted from the auction, not us as labor. Us as something to occupy your attention while he filed this." She looked at the paper. "He expected you to be dealing with 2 strangers on your property and distracted and short of options. And instead," Gideon said slowly, "and instead you have someone who read your ledgers and knows your margin and has 60 days to find a way to keep this land out of his hands." He looked at her for a long time. The wind came off the ridge again and moved through the dry grass in the south pasture, past the fence she'd fixed, past the posts that were straight now and the wire that was taut. "Who would you start with?" he said. "Of the 3 families." She'd already thought about it. "The Cabreras," she said. "They're closest to the ridge and their water situation is the worst. If they're in, the others will listen." He nodded once, slowly. She looked back at the paper. 60 days was not a lot of time. It was also not no time. She'd been here 3 weeks and she'd fixed the fence and found the ledger problem and figured out the Heller situation and read every document in the back room. And the operation was not healthy, but it was not dead either. And there was the spring up in that ridge country that nobody had thought to make an asset instead of just a target. She was tired. She was angry in the specific, useful way that had been building since she read her own name on an auction notice. She had a dead father's boots on her feet and a 12-year-old brother sleeping in a ranch hand's room off the barn and 60 days to work with. She folded the reassessment notice and put it in her coat pocket. "I'll write the letter to the Cabreras tonight," she said. "We should ride out there by the end of the week before Vane has time to reach them first." Gideon looked at her. That thing in his expression again. The recalibration. The update. "All right," he said. That night she sat at the kitchen table after Eli had gone to sleep, and she wrote the letter to the Cabrera family, and then she sat for a while with the pen in her hand, thinking about the shape of what she was trying to do. It was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that, if it went wrong, would go catastrophically wrong, and if it went right, would have to keep going right for a long time before it was finished. She thought about the auction platform, about 40 people who'd looked at their feet, about Silas Vane half-turned with his hands behind his back, talking about her like she was a line item. She thought about what happened to people who had nothing left to lose and figured out, eventually, that this meant they also had nothing left to be afraid of. She sealed the letter. She went to bed. She was up before the sun. The Cabrera Ranch was half a day's ride south and east, through country that turned scrubby and thin before it opened back up into decent grazing land near a dry creek that probably ran well in spring and didn't do much the rest of the year. Mara had been there once as a girl, accompanying her father on some errand she couldn't remember the specifics of, and what she recalled was a woman hanging laundry in a wind that kept undoing her work, rehinging sheets that blew sideways as fast as she could pin them, with the specific patience of someone who had decided that the wind was not going to win today even if it took all afternoon. Rosa Cabrera was still that woman. She was somewhere past 50, with hands that looked like they'd been worked hard for decades, and a face that had earned every line on it. And when she came to the door and saw Gideon cross, she nodded once with the particular economy of someone who'd known him by reputation long enough that the introduction was unnecessary. When she saw Mara, she looked longer. "You're Thomas Ellison's girl," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "I heard what they did." She said it plainly, not as condolence and not as conversation opener, just as an acknowledgement that she was aware of the facts. "Come in." Her husband Domingo was at the table with what looked like account books, and he stood when they came in with the careful courtesy of a man who had been raised to stand when people entered a room, regardless of circumstances. He was a decade older than Rosa, at least, a tall man who'd probably been powerful, and was now just large in a way that spoke of diminishment without defeat. Mara put the letter on the table, the one she'd written, plus the reassessment notice, plus a copy of the water access documentation she'd found in the back room at Gideon's. She let them read. She'd learned this from watching her father make the opposite mistake. He'd always talked first, explained first, laid out his case in words before giving anyone the actual documents. By the time he got to the papers, people had already formed their response to his voice and his tone and his manner. She let the papers speak first. Papers didn't have a tone. Domingo read slowly. Rosa read fast and then watched her husband read, which told Mara something about their dynamic that was useful. "Vane filed this," Domingo said. It was what Gideon had said, the same flat acknowledgement. "We believe so," Mara said. "The timing is not a coincidence," Rosa said. She was looking at the water documentation now. "He's been after the spring since before you bought this land," she said to Gideon. "I know." "My cousin sold his north acreage 3 years ago," she said. "He held the fence line closest to the catlit drainage. After he sold, the water in our lower pasture dropped by 1/3. She set the paper down. "Vane bought that acreage inside a week." The room went quiet with the weight of that particular piece of information, which none of them had connected before, and all of them were connecting now. Mara said, "If he gets the spring access through Gideon's property, he controls the water for the entire valley floor." "We know what he'd do with it," Rosa said. "Yes, so I want to talk about what we can do with it first." Domingo looked up from the papers. He had steady eyes, the kind that took their time. What are you proposing? She'd thought about how to say this on the ride out, going over it the way she went over everything. Not scripting it, because scripted things sounded scripted, and people knew, but understanding the shape of what she needed to communicate. She was asking them to trust her. She was asking them to trust Gideon, which was a thing they'd apparently declined to do for 6 years, on the basis that Gideon had never given them a reason to. She was asking them to take on risk for a benefit that was real, but not immediate, and contingent on things working in a particular order. She told them about the water-sharing arrangement. She'd worked out rough numbers the night before. What the spring could supply, how many properties it could reasonably reach, what a fair agreement would look like that kept control of the source with Gideon while distributing access in a way that made the arrangement worth something to the other families. She laid it out in about 10 minutes without stopping, and when she was done, she stopped and let it sit there. Domingo looked at his wife. Rosa was looking at Mara. "How old are you?" Rosa said. 21. Rosa Cabrera made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Where were you 4 years ago?" "Fixing fences on a ranch that was about to be stolen," Mara said. That one Rosa did laugh at, a short, genuine sound that was over quickly. Then she was serious again. "If Vane finds out we're talking to you, he already knows Gideon and I are talking to people," Mara said. "The reassessment notice was him telling us he knows we're moving. He's done waiting." She looked at both of them. "Which means we don't have the option of moving slowly." Domingo closed the account books on the table, a deliberate gesture. "What do you need from us?" "A yes or a no," she said, "and if it's yes, I need you to think about who else in this valley is tired enough of Silas Vane to do something about it." It was Rosa who answered, and the answer was yes, and she gave them 4 names. The next 2 weeks were the hardest Mara had worked since the last 2 weeks. She and Gideon rode out to 3 of the 4 families Rosa had named, and Mara did the talking while Gideon provided the particular quality of silent credibility that came from being a man who'd held his land for 6 years against Vane's pressure, not through confrontation, but through sheer stubborn presence. She began to understand that this was its own kind of communication. He hadn't won any battles. He just refused to leave. And in refusing to leave, he demonstrated something about the land that made people believe it was worth defending. The 3rd family was the Wainwrights, who had a daughter Eli's age and a water situation worse than the Cabreras. And the father, a man named Curtis Wainwright with a burn scar on his left forearm and a way of going very still when he was thinking, asked her 3 questions. Not easy questions. Questions about what happened if Vane challenged the water agreements in court, and what happened if the arrangement broke down between the participating families, and what happened to Gideon's loan if the payment couldn't be made inside 60 days regardless of what they built together. She answered all 3 honestly, including the 3rd one, which was that she didn't know yet and was working on it. "You don't know," Curtis said. "I know that 60 days is enough time if the catlit agreements generate the right kind of attention and the right kind of backing," she said. "I don't know that they will. What I know is that doing nothing guarantees we all end up exactly where Vane wants us." Curtis Wainwright looked at his burn scar for a moment. Then he looked up. "My brother-in-law is a surveyor out of Casper," he said. "He owes me a favor. If you need the water line mapped professionally before you put anything in front of a judge, I need that more than almost anything else," she said. "I'll write to him tonight." She nearly let herself feel relieved right then. She didn't, because relief before a thing was done was how you got careless, but she noted it somewhere and put it aside. The 4th name on Rosa's list was the problem. His name was Preston Cole, and he had a property northeast of the Cabreras that sat on high ground and had the best grazing in the valley outside of what Gideon held. He also had, as Rosa had warned her with a particular expression that Mara had filed carefully, a long memory and a specific grievance against Gideon Cross that Rosa hadn't wanted to explain with Gideon present. She went to see Preston Cole alone. He came to the door of his house and saw her and looked behind her for Gideon, and when he wasn't there, he held the door open and let her in, which she took as a reasonable sign. His house was fuller than Gideon's. Family pictures, a woman's touch in the kitchen, a child's drawing tacked to the wall beside the window. He had a wife who brought coffee without being asked and then made herself absent, which Mara also noted. "I know why you're here," Cole said. He was a blocky man, not tall, with a broad face and a beard going gray at the edges. Rosa sent you. Rosa gave me your name. She would. He said it without rancor. What are you offering? She went through it again. He listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was not always a good sign. Some people who didn't interrupt were saving everything up. When she finished, he said, "And Cross is part of this. It's his spring, his land. Yes." Gideon Cross borrowed $300 from my father in 1871 when he was buying the Ridge property, Cole said. My father died before Cross paid it back. Cross never offered it to his estate. Mara looked at him. She hadn't known this. She was fairly certain Gideon hadn't told her because he didn't know she'd be sitting in this room today. I didn't know that, she said. I expect not. She thought about it for a moment. She thought about the options. She could say this was between Cole and Gideon and should be resolved separately, which was the clean answer and the one that let her off the hook. She could tell Cole that $300 from 1871 was going to cost everyone in the valley a great deal more than $300 if it kept him out of this arrangement. Both of these things were true. What would settle it? She said. Cole blinked. What? The debt. What would settle it in your view? He looked at her for a long moment. $300 and an apology, he said. From him, not from you. I'll bring him here, she said. If he won't come, or if he comes and won't apologize, then you have every right to decline. But I'm asking you to wait until you've heard from him before you decide. She rode back to Gideon's ranch faster than she'd ridden out. She found him in the barn working on a bridle that had needed mending for a while based on the look of it, and she told him what Cole had said, watching his face the whole time. His face did several things in a short period. None of them were comfortable. I forgot, he said finally. I know. I didn't forget on purpose. After his father died, He stopped, set the bridle down. I forgot. $300 and an apology, she said. That's what he wants. I don't have $300 right now. I know. Can you get it? He thought about it. I can sell 2 of the contracted cattle back to Heller at current price. It won't be $300 exactly. How close? $260, maybe $270. And the apology. He looked at her. Gideon. She kept her voice level. I need to know if you can say a sincere apology to a man you wronged. Not a strategic one. Not because it closes a deal, because you actually owe him one. I know I owe him one, he said, and the way he said it, flat and uncomfortable and without defensiveness, told her what she needed to know. Then we ride to the Cole Ranch tomorrow, she said. They rode to the Cole Ranch the next morning. Gideon went in alone while Mara waited with the horses. She didn't know what he said. She heard the door close behind him, and she stood in the yard and looked at the high ground to the east and thought about water in 60 days and the shape of what was being built. He came out 20 minutes later. His face was not easy to read, but it was not the face of a man who had just failed at something. He's in, Gideon said. Good. She handed him his reins. What did you say? What needed saying? She looked at him. She let it go. With Cole on board, the composition of the arrangement changed. His property's elevation meant that a water line from the Catlet Spring could reach 3 additional properties by gravity alone, which changed the engineering problem from difficult to merely hard. Curtis Wainwright's brother-in-law arrived from Casper 8 days later. A compact man named Aldous Webb, who smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and who walked the ridgeland with Mara for a full day taking measurements and asking questions she wasn't always able to answer, and a few she was, and at the end of it he sat down in Gideon's kitchen with his notes and his pipe and his measuring instruments and said the things she'd been afraid to hope for. It's doable, he said. The spring's output is sufficient, and the elevation differential is favorable. You could run a main line from the upper collection point to a distribution box at the ridge bottom and branch from there. 3 months of work if you have enough hands. We have 43 days, she said. Aldous Webb looked at his pipe. That's not 3 months. No, it's not. Can it be done in 43 days? He was quiet for a while. He smoked. He looked at his survey drawings. Not a finished system, he said, but a working system, enough to demonstrate viability and get water to the first 3 properties. with 10 or 12 people who know what they're doing and don't stop? He turned one of his drawings over and started writing on the back. Yes. This was the moment. She recognized it as she was standing in it, when things stopped being an idea and became a plan. There was a specific quality to that transition, a particular weight that settled into the chest when the possible became the definite. She gave herself about 4 seconds to feel it. Then she started talking about logistics. The work began 5 days later. She'd spent those 5 days in motion she would later remember as a blur, coordinating with 4 families, planning material procurement, negotiating with a hardware supplier in the next county who wanted cash she didn't have yet, and eventually agreed to deferred payment against the signed water agreements, which were documents she'd written herself in longhand and had checked against what she knew of territorial contract law from 2 books she'd found on the bottom shelf in Gideon's back room. The first day of construction work on the water line was also the first day that made her genuinely doubt whether any of this was going to work. Not because of the work itself. The work was going the way hard physical labor goes when people are motivated and organized, grinding, imprecise, punctuated by small problems that had to be solved on the spot. Domingo Cabrera turned out to be extraordinarily useful, with pipe fitting in a way nobody had mentioned, and Curtis Wainwright could work a post driver for 8 hours without visible deterioration. The doubt came from a rider who appeared at the upper work site mid-afternoon on the first day. He wasn't anyone she recognized. He sat his horse on the ridge above them and watched for a long time without coming closer or saying anything, and then he turned and rode back over the ridge in the direction of Red Hollow. He hadn't been close enough to read his face. He'd been close enough to count people and see what they were doing. Gideon came to stand beside her while she was still watching the empty ridge. "Vane knows," she said. "He probably knew when we rode to the Cabreras." "This is different. Watching the site is different." She thought about the reassessment notice and its 60-day window. 37 days remaining now. He's going to move before we're finished. What do you think he does? She'd been turning this over for several days, the question of what Silas Vane's next move looked like, given that his previous moves had assumed she and Gideon would be isolated and reactive and running out of time. They were still running out of time, but they were no longer isolated and they were not reacting. "He goes to the county," she said. "He challenges the water agreements on some kind of procedural ground, tries to get an injunction on the construction before we can finish enough to demonstrate viability." "How fast can he do that?" "Fast. If Geddes helps him with the paperwork, and if he has anyone on the county board, fast." Gideon looked at the ridge. "Do you know who's on the county board?" "I know 3 of 5 names. I've been trying to find out about the other 2. She paused. "One of the 3 I know is Owen Marsh. He was at the auction." He was quiet. "He looked at his feet," she said. "He was one of the ones who looked at his feet." That could mean anything. It could mean he's not committed to Vane. It could mean he's ashamed. She looked at the ridge. Ashamed is something to work with. She made the decision that evening, in the kitchen after dinner, with the lamp burning low and Eli asleep, and Gideon across the table from her reading the county land law book she'd found and written 10 pages of notes from. "I need to go to Red Hollow," she said. He looked up. "I need to see Owen Marsh before Vane does, and I need to file the water agreements at the county office before they can be challenged as informal arrangements." She'd been thinking about this since the rider on the ridge. If they're on record, a challenge becomes a public proceeding. Vane can still try, but it's not a quiet administrative decision anymore. "He'll be in Red Hollow," Gideon said, "or his people will." "I know. Last time you were in Red Hollow, I know what happened last time." She met his eyes. "This time is different." He held her gaze. "I'm coming with you." "You need to stay with the work site. If you're not here, Eli can manage the morning," he said. "He's been managing the morning for 2 weeks." She opened her mouth to argue and stopped, because he was right, and because this was one of those moments where she had to let someone else be right without making it a negotiation. "Fine," she said. "We leave at first light." They rode into Red Hollow on a Thursday morning, and the town looked exactly the same as it always had, which was one of the things that still struck her sometimes. How unchanged a place looked after it had done terrible things in it. The main street was the same boards and the same dust. The auction platform was gone, she noticed, or stored somewhere out of sight. The county office was a single-story building next to the post office, with a hand-lettered sign and a clerk inside who looked up when the door opened and then looked again when he recognized her. She filed the water agreements before she said anything else. All four, signed by all parties, with Aldous Webb's survey drawings attached as exhibits. The clerk stamped them and wrote the filing number in his book, and the whole thing took 11 minutes, and when it was done, she allowed herself exactly one breath of something adjacent to relief before moving on. Owen Marsh's office was above the dry goods store. She climbed the stairs alone. Gideon had positioned himself at the base of them, which she understood was a choice he'd made about what kind of support was useful here. Marsh was a man in his late 50s who ran to the thin side of respectable, with a politician's habit of arranging his expression before the conversation started. He arranged it when she came in, and then clearly had trouble holding the arrangement because what he'd prepared for was probably not her. "Miss Ellison," he said. "I'm not here to make a problem for you," she said, sitting down without being invited. "I'm here to tell you that the water agreements are filed at the county office as of this morning, and that Silas Vane is going to challenge them, and that when he does, it will be a public proceeding." Marsh's arranged expression shifted. "I'm not sure what you expect me to. I expect you to remember that a public proceeding about water rights in this valley is going to require the county board to go on record," she said. "On record about whether the Catlet Spring access is being developed for the benefit of 6 ranch families, or whether that development can be blocked at the request of one man who already controls most of the valley's cattle market." "That's an oversimplification of Mr. Marsh." She kept her voice even. "I stood on an auction platform in this town 5 weeks ago. I saw you in the crowd. I know what you did and what you didn't do." He looked at his desk. "I'm not asking you to be a hero," she said. "I'm not asking you to stand up for me or go to war with Vane. I'm asking you to know that what's being built up on that ridge right now is legal. It's documented, and it's going to change what this valley looks like in 10 years if nobody stops it." She stood up. "And I'm asking you to think about which side of that you want your name on." She left without waiting for an answer. Gideon was at the bottom of the stairs. He looked at her. "I don't know if it worked," she said, "but I said what needed saying." They were 2 blocks from the stable where they'd left the horses when she saw them. 3 men she didn't know by name, but recognized by type. The specific posture of men who worked for someone and were demonstrating their employment by standing in a location where they blocked something. In this case, the narrow alley between the harness shop and the milliner's that was the most direct route to the stable. She and Gideon stopped at the same moment. "We can go around," she said quietly. "We can," he said. "That's what he wants. He wants us to know he can put men wherever he needs to." "I know." She looked at the 3 men. They were looking back. None of them had moved. It was the specific stillness of people waiting to see what the response was going to be. "Walk normally," she said. "Mara, walk normally," she said again, and started forward. She heard Gideon behind her a half-step later. She walked at her regular pace, which was not slow, and she did not look at the 3 men, and she did not alter her course, and they held their position until she was close enough that it would require an overt choice to maintain it, and then one of them stepped back and the other 2 followed, because that's what happens when the first one moves. She walked through the gap without slowing. She could feel them on either side of her, and she did not look at them, because looking was giving them something, and she had decided this morning in this town that she was done giving Silas Vane's people anything she didn't have to give. They reached the stable. They got the horses. They rode north. Neither of them said anything for a while. The town fell behind. The road unfurled ahead in the October light, pale and long, cutting north toward the ridge country. "He's going to escalate," Gideon said eventually. "Yes. Those men weren't there to do anything. They were there to be seen." "I know. The next ones won't just be standing in alleys." She looked at the road. 29 days left on the loan. The water line was going up. The agreements were filed. Owen Marsh was either going to do the right thing or he wasn't, and she didn't have any more moves to make on him than the one she'd made. "There's something I haven't told you," Gideon said. She looked at him. "The lawyer," he said. The one who left the territory after reading my papers. He left me a letter before he went. Told me he'd found evidence of falsified survey records in the original Vane property filings from 1869. If those records were challenged, the records from 1869, if they were challenged, his claim on the water rights to the lower valley drainage would be void. She stared at him. She counted to 3 carefully. You've had this letter for how long? 4 years. And you didn't... She stopped, started again. Where is it? In the back room, he said. In the wooden box. She thought about the wooden box. She thought about the 3 years of ledgers she'd found in it, and all the things she'd read, and all the things, apparently, she'd missed. I need to see that letter, she said. When we get back. When we get back, she agreed. She rode the rest of the way with her mind running ahead of her on the road. Past the ridge, past the work site, past the 29 days that remained, to a wooden box in a back room on a ranch above the tree line, and a letter from a man who'd been frightened enough to leave a territory but careful enough before he left to write down what he'd found. The letter was 4 pages, written in a small, slightly hurried hand that told her the lawyer had been thinking faster than he was comfortable with when he wrote it. His name was Edmund Farr, and he'd practiced out of Cheyenne before he came to the valley, and apparently returned there or somewhere else after, and he had the specific gift of a man trained in legal language for making complicated things almost but not quite clear to people who weren't. She read it twice at the kitchen table while Gideon stood near the stove and watched her read and said nothing. The core of it was this. In 1869, when Silas Vane had filed his original land claims under the homestead provisions, the survey documentation supporting his western boundary, the boundary that included his claimed rights to the lower valley drainage, and by extension the water access connecting to the Catlet spring system, had been prepared by a surveyor named Hugh Delacourt. Edmund Farr had found, in the Territorial Land Office records, 2 separate surveys attributed to Delacourt from the same period, for adjacent parcels, that used different baseline measurements, the kind of difference that could be a recording error, or could be the kind of adjustment that moved a property line a quarter-mile west and incorporated a drainage feature that would otherwise have fallen outside the claimed parcel. Delacourt had died in 1874. Farr had noted this. She set the letter down. He moved the line, she said. That's what Farr thought. Farr was careful about how he wrote it. He said inconsistency and may warrant further examination. But he meant Vane moved the line. Or had it moved? Or had it moved? She looked at the 4 pages. If the original survey is wrong, his claim to the lower drainage is wrong. His claim to the water rights he's been leveraging against every family in this valley for 20 years is wrong. A falsified survey from 1869 is hard to prove, Gideon said. Delacourt's dead. The man who filed the original claim is the most powerful person in this county. Farr was scared enough to leave. Farr was scared enough to leave and careful enough to write this down before he did. She picked the letter up again. He referenced the specific document numbers in the Territorial Land Office. He referenced the page numbers. He made it as easy as possible for the next person who looked. She looked at Gideon. He didn't leave because he wanted to. He left because he thought there was nobody here who could do anything with what he'd found. Maybe he was right. Maybe. She folded the letter along its original creases. Aldous Webb is a licensed surveyor. Gideon went still. He's been on this land for 2 weeks, she said. He knows the ridge country better than anyone who isn't standing in this room, and he has the equipment to pull a proper baseline measurement from the same reference points Delacourt used in 1869. She looked at Gideon. If the measurements don't match, we'd need to get the original filing from the territorial office in Cheyenne. Curtis Wainwright's brother-in-law just came from Casper. Cheyenne is 4 days from here by rail. He was quiet. She watched him work through it. Not the logistics, she could tell. He was past the logistics. He was working through the thing underneath, which was the question of what it meant to take a step this large, in this direction, against this man, with nothing guaranteed on the other side. This changes what we're doing, he said. It changes what we're capable of doing. She kept her voice level. We were building a defense, something to slow him down, keep the land, buy time. This, she held up the letter. This is different. This is the thing underneath all of it. If the original claim is fraudulent, everything he's built from it is built on something rotten. We'd need a lawyer willing to take it. We'd need Aldous to find the discrepancy first and put his name to it. Then we'd need a lawyer. She paused. Farr went back to Cheyenne, presumably. He was scared here. He might not be scared there. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge, and the shutter knocked once against the house. The same shutter that had been knocking since she arrived and which she still hadn't fixed, partly from busyness and partly, she'd admitted to herself lately, because it had become something like a landmark. She knew exactly where she was when she heard it. This could go wrong in 20 different ways, he said. I know. If Vane finds out we're in the territorial records before we have anything confirmed, he'll know what we found and he'll know from who. And Farr left for a reason. I know that too. And the loan still comes due in 29 days regardless of what we find in any land office. I know, she said, and she said it without impatience because he wasn't telling her things she hadn't already thought about. He was being precise, which was how he handled things that worried him, and she'd learned to read it as a form of engagement rather than resistance. When he stopped being precise was when she'd worry. Who goes to Cheyenne, he said. Not you. You need to be here. She thought about it. Eli is too young and too visible. She let it sit for a second. It needs to be someone Vane's people don't know. Someone who can get into the territorial land office as a routine visitor and pull documents without causing attention. You're describing a stranger. No, I'm describing someone Vane hasn't cataloged yet. She thought of Rosa Cabrera, then set that thought aside. Rosa was known in the region, connected to this situation now in ways that could be traced. She thought of the Wainwright daughter, too young. She thought through every person she'd met in the past 5 weeks. Aldous Webb, she said. You want to send the surveyor to pull land records. He goes to Cheyenne, requests the original Delacourt survey documentation as a professional courtesy. Licensed surveyors request historical records for reference work regularly. It's not unusual. He gets the page numbers Farr specified. He brings them back, compares them to his own measurements on the ridge. She looked at Gideon. If there's a discrepancy, we have a licensed professional who can testify to it. We have Farr's letter documenting that the issue existed and was noted 4 years ago. And we have a record of Vane's behavior in this valley that now has a possible explanation. Gideon sat down at the table. He put his hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a moment. You know what we're actually doing here? Yes. We're not defending the ranch anymore. No. We're going after the foundation of everything he has. If it works, this valley changes, she said. And if it doesn't, we tried, which is more than anyone's done in 20 years. She could see the thing moving in him that she'd seen moving for weeks. Not reluctance exactly, but the specific resistance of a man who had spent a long time building walls and was being asked to stop defending them and go somewhere open instead. It was a different kind of courage, not the courage of holding ground, but the courage of moving across uncertain terrain with no cover. He said, Talk to Aldous tonight. She talked to Aldous Webb that evening after dinner in the spare plainness of Gideon's back room with the wooden box open on the table and Farr's letter laid out alongside the survey drawings. Aldous read with his pipe unlit, which she'd noted he only did when he was concentrating hard, and when he finished he sat without speaking for long enough that she started to prepare for a number. The page numbers he's citing, Aldous said, correspond to the section filed under the 1869 Territorial Extension Act. I know that section. Pulled from it twice for reference work near Laramie. He picked up one of his own drawings. The baseline he used for my measurements on the ridge. That's the Catlet Formation reference point. It's the same reference Delacourt would have used for a filing in that zone. He set the drawing down. If the measurements don't correspond, it'll be visible. Not to everyone, but to anyone who knows what they're looking at. Will you go to Cheyenne? He looked at his pipe. That's asking me to put my name on something that's going against Silas Vane. Yes, it is. I'm a surveyor from Casper. I've got work to go back to. I know. If it goes sideways, you were a professional requesting historical records for reference purposes. You didn't do anything wrong. She looked at him. What you'd find, if you find it, is a matter of public record. It's been sitting in that land office for 20 years. You'd just be the person who read it. Aldous picked up his pipe and turned it in his fingers. "Curtis Wainwright's a good man," he said. "Helped me move into my workshop when I set up in Casper. Didn't ask for anything." She waited. "I can be on the morning stage," he said. The next 12 days ran the way hard deadline days always run. In one direction, without looking sideways, with the constant low-level feeling that there was something important she was forgetting and the ongoing discovery that there usually was. The waterline moved up the ridge in stages, Domingo Cabrera and Curtis Wainwright driving it forward with a consistency that she'd come to rely on in the way you rely on things you've tested and found she had. Eli worked the lower section alongside the Wainwright hand, a leather-faced man named Peters who'd adopted Eli with the particular affection that taciturn older men sometimes develop for industrious boys, teaching him things about pipe gradients and soil density that Mara suspected would be useful to him for the rest of his life. Gideon managed the ridge access, which meant being on the upper section from before light until after dark, and coming back to the house each night with the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been working hard in cold air at elevation. She fed him. He ate without comment. They talked about the day's progress and the next day's plan, and sometimes nothing at all, and the silence between them had continued its evolution into something she'd stopped analyzing because the analysis kept arriving at a conclusion she wasn't ready to sit with yet. On the 14th day, Aldous Webb came back from Cheyenne. He came into the yard in the late afternoon while she was on the south fence, checking a section that had gone soft again after the rain, and he walked out to her instead of waiting at the house, which told her something before he opened his mouth. He handed her a paper. It was a copy, careful, precise, in Aldous's drafting hand, of specific measurements from the 1869 Delacorte filing. She looked at the numbers. She looked at the numbers on his survey drawing of the ridge. She was not a surveyor, but she could read figures, and she could see when two sets of figures didn't produce the same answer. "It's there," she said. "It's there." Aldous sat down on the fence rail beside her. The western boundary measurement in the 1869 filing is short by a fraction that reads like a recording error unless you're standing on the ground with instruments. But it's not a recording error. A recording error moves a line by feet. This moves it by just over a quarter mile. Enough to incorporate the lower drainage. The water access rights that flow from it, and about 300 acres of bottom land that would otherwise have fallen on the neighboring parcel. He paused. The neighboring parcel that was vacant in 1869, and that Vane purchased in 1872 from a family named Durnin. She looked at him. He bought it anyway. 3 years later, for a number that suggests the Durnins didn't know what they had. Aldous folded his hands on his knee. My professional assessment, and I'll put my name to this, is that the Delacorte survey as filed is inconsistent with the physical evidence of the reference points that survey claims to use. The discrepancy is not explainable by equipment variation or recording practice standard to the period. You'll testify to that. I'll write it up formally and sign it. If it comes to testimony, I'll testify. He picked up his pipe. I talked to Edmund Farr. She went very still. He's in Cheyenne. He's been in Cheyenne. He never went back to practicing, but he's there. Aldous lit his pipe, the first time in 2 weeks she'd seen him do it in something other than concentration. He was scared when he left here. He's still cautious, but he's been living with the knowledge of what he found for 4 years, and I think that weight gets heavier, not lighter, over time. He looked at her. He'll write a statement. He won't come back to the territory yet, but he'll write a statement and he'll have it notarized and sent. She sat on the fence in the late afternoon light, and she let herself understand what she was now holding. Farr's letter, which she already had. Aldous Webb's professional survey comparison, which he'd just handed her. A notarized statement from the lawyer who'd first identified the discrepancy. And the water agreements, already on file at the county office, representing 6 families who'd organized their properties around a resource that Vane had no legitimate claim to. We need a lawyer to file it, she said. Farr knows one in Cheyenne, younger man. He said he was willing to look at the package. How willing? Willing enough that Farr said he'd advance the introduction. Aldous looked at the ridge. The water line? How close? 7 days if the weather holds. Then you've got a working water system demonstrated and documented before any legal challenge to the agreements can be heard. That's what I'm counting on. The weather did not hold. It came in 2 days later off the north, the kind of early season storm that the Ridge Country specialized in. Not violent exactly, but sustained, with a specific quality of cold that got into everything and stayed. Work on the upper section slowed by 2/3. The lower section could continue, but the upper section was the critical connection, the point where the line from the Catlet Spring joined the distribution run, and without it the system didn't function. She stood on the ridge in the second day of the storm and looked at what they had and what they still needed and did the arithmetic of time versus weather. Curtis Wainwright came to stand beside her. He had ice on his beard. "We could push through it," he said. "We could push through it and lose 2 people to cold exposure and not finish anyway. The alternative is, I know what the alternative is." She looked at the unfinished upper section. 15 days left on the loan. 8 days of work left on the line at good pace. Storm that could last anywhere from 2 more days to a week. Who do we know who's worked in cold construction? Curtis thought. Peters has. Oil operation up in Montana, he told me once. Get Peters up here. Peters, who had the weather-independent attitude of a man for whom conditions were always irrelevant to outcomes, assessed the situation in the storm for about 3 minutes and said they could work in this if they modified the order of operations, prioritized the connection point, worked the branch lines outward, keep fewer people on the upper section at once to prevent crowding in the cold. He said it with the same effect he used to discuss pipe gradients with Eli, which was no affect at all. They lost 1 full day to the worst of the storm and came back the next morning to ground that was hard and cold and workable. 11 days left. On the 9th day, Silas Vane made his move. She should have anticipated the exact form of it, and later she would fault herself for not doing so. She'd anticipated a court challenge to the water agreements. That was still probably coming. She'd anticipated pressure on the county board. She'd been watching for any direct action against the work site. What she hadn't fully accounted for was the loan itself. Royce Draper came to the property for the second time, and this time he had a different document. First Territorial Bank, he explained, had decided to exercise a clause in the loan agreement allowing for immediate call in cases where the value of the underlying asset had materially changed. The reassessment they'd filed 6 weeks ago had been accepted by the county. The loan was being called. Not in 60 days. In 10. Gideon read the document at the kitchen table with his jaw doing the thing it did when he was managing something carefully. She stood beside him and read over his shoulder. "This clause," she said to Draper, who was standing near the door with his leather satchel and his clean coat. "Show me the original loan documentation where this clause appears." "I'm not obligated to present—" "I have a copy of the original loan documentation," she said, "in the next room. If you'd like to wait while I compare them, I'm happy to do that." Draper looked at his satchel. "Or," she said, "you could tell me which section the clause appears in and save us both the time." He gave her a section number. She went to the back room and got the loan copy she'd read in her first week and opened it to that section and read it twice and came back to the kitchen. "The clause requires written notice of 30 days before exercise," she said. "Your notice today is the first written notice I have record of. You owe us 30 days from today." The reassessment notice was a county document issued by a separate process. It is not written notice from the bank under the terms of this loan. She looked at him. "I'll consult with legal counsel to confirm my reading, but I'd recommend you consult with yours before you leave today." Draper left with less certainty in his bearing than he'd arrived with. She stood in the yard after he rode away, and she breathed through her nose and she let the cold air do something useful in her chest. 30 days. She'd bought 30 days by reading the loan document carefully enough and being willing to say what she'd read in a voice that didn't ask permission. Gideon came out and stood beside her. "He'll go to Getty's," she said. "Yes. Getty's will confirm I'm right about the clause, and then he and Vane will figure out another way." She looked at the road. 10 days would have destroyed us. 30 days. "Might not," Gideon said. "The legal package is going to Cheyenne at the end of the week," she said. "Aldis's survey, Farr's statement, the letter. If the lawyer Farr knows we'll move quickly, that's a lot of if." "Yes." She looked at him. Do you have a better option? He didn't. They both knew he didn't. The legal package went to Cheyenne by courier at the end of the week, addressed to a man named Theodore Crane, attorney, with a cover letter she'd written and rewritten 4 times and ended up writing plain, because the plain version was the honest one, and she'd decided that was all she had to offer. 3 days later, the waterline was finished. Not elegantly. There were sections that would need reinforcement before winter, and the distribution box at the ridge bottom was cruder than Aldous would have preferred, and the connection to the Cabrera lower pasture leaked at one joint that Peters fixed with materials that were approximate but functional. It was a working system. Water from the Catlet Spring reached the collection point, ran down the main line, and branched to the first 3 properties with a pressure that was sufficient, if not impressive. Domingo Cabrera opened the valve on his lower pasture feed and stood beside it with his hands at his sides while the water ran, and his face did something private that nobody commented on. Rosa put her hand on Mara's arm briefly and then let it go, and Mara understood this to be the Cabrera equivalent of a considerable expression of feeling. They were 4 days into the working system, with the legal package in Cheyenne and 23 days remaining on the loan's legitimate 30-day window when Silas Vane came to the ranch himself. He came alone, which surprised her. She'd expected an approach with men around him, the usual architecture of his presence. Instead, she looked out from the barn where she was working and saw a single rider coming down from the north road, which was the direction you didn't expect traffic from, and then recognized the horse and then recognized the man on it. She walked to the middle of the yard and waited. He was bigger than she'd registered on the auction square. Not physically larger, but bigger in the way people are when you encounter them in a context where they feel they have natural authority, where the landscape belongs to them. He had that quality now, riding onto Gideon's land, which struck her as a particular kind of audacity she hadn't fully credited him with. He dismounted with ease for a man his age and led his horse a few steps and stopped. "Miss Ellison," he said. She said nothing. He looked around the yard, the barn, the house with its missing porch railing, the south fence line, repaired. He was reading the property the same way she had on the day she arrived, which told her he'd been doing this all his life. "I'd like to speak with Cross," he said. "He's working," she said. "I'm sure he can take a few minutes. I'll carry your message when he's done." Vane looked at her. He had the specific quality of a man who was accustomed to being either obeyed or simply not opposed, and she could see him locating her in his understanding of people, trying to assign her to a category that explained her behavior. "This doesn't need to be complicated," he said. "I came to make a straightforward offer." "I'll hear it." He looked toward the house. "Inside, perhaps?" "Here's fine." He adjusted to this without obvious irritation. "The bank holds a note on this property. I'm prepared to purchase that note and offer Cross a settlement that allows him to relocate with enough capital to start again somewhere more suitable. And the water agreements would be null under the new ownership, yes. And the 6 families who signed them would be free to make separate arrangements. With him, she didn't say. She didn't say it because she didn't need to. "Mr. Vane," she said, "the note on this property has 23 days remaining under its legitimate terms. In that time, or before it, there may be developments in the Territorial Land Office that make the question of this note considerably less important than you currently believe." Something shifted in his eyes, just slightly. "I don't know what you think you've found," he said. And there it was. Not denial, not confusion, but specific acknowledgement that she'd found something. He'd known she was in the records before she'd said it. "I think I've found that the Catlet Spring drainage rights your operations depend on were never legitimately yours," she said. "I think a licensed surveyor can demonstrate that within the existing documentation. And I think there's a lawyer in Cheyenne who is currently deciding whether he agrees." Vane was quiet. She'd learned to pay attention when loud men went quiet. "You're an interesting woman," he said. It was not a compliment exactly, it was an assessment. "I'm a woman who read the documents," she said. "That's all." "What do you want?" he said. "What is it you actually want out of this?" The question landed differently than she expected. Not manipulative, not rhetorical. He was actually asking. He was a man who'd spent his life finding the price of things, and he was asking what she cost. And she understood suddenly that in his view of the world, everything had a number, and knowing the number was the beginning of every transaction. I want the families in this valley to have access to water they've been manipulated out of for 20 years, she said. I want Gideon Cross to keep his property. I want the Cabreras and the Wainwrights and the Coles to have agreements that hold. And I want Harlan Geddes to know that whatever he filed on my father's estate was signed by a man who was dying and who didn't understand what he was signing. She looked at him steadily. That's what I want. He studied her. None of that requires you to be ruined, she said. You have legitimate cattle operations. You have land that's actually yours. But the water rights, the property line, the 20 years of using that to squeeze people, that has to end. He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze without effort, because she'd stopped being afraid of him somewhere around the 14th day on the ridge in the cold, though she couldn't have said exactly when. You don't have a lawyer yet, he said. Not one who's agreed. No, not yet. A discrepancy in a 40-year-old survey is difficult to prove. Yes. Aldous Webb is a careful man, though. Vane put his hand on his horse's neck. He looked at the ridge, the place where the catlit spring ran, invisible from here, important as weather. She watched him look at it. I need time to consider this, he said. 23 days, she said. That's what we both have. He mounted his horse. He looked down at her from the saddle with an expression she couldn't fully read, not anger, not respect exactly, something that was the older, more complicated version of both. Your father? He said. I knew him. She said nothing. He was a stubborn man, Vane said. Yes, she said. He was. He rode back up the north road the way he'd come, and she stood in the yard and watched him go until the road bent and he was gone, and then she turned and found Gideon standing at the edge of the barn. He'd been there a while, she could tell. He'd heard most of it. She walked toward him, and the shutter knocked against the house once behind her, and she stopped in front of him and looked at his face, which was doing the complicated thing it did when he was working through something. Did you know he was coming? She said. No. What do you think he does now? Gideon looked at the north road where the dust had already settled. I think he goes back to town and he thinks about what you said to him, about what he actually stands to lose. He looked at her. And I think he's never had anyone lay it out to him like that. Without anger, without asking for something impossible. I asked for quite a lot. You asked for what was fair, he said. That's different from impossible. He paused. He might still fight it. He might. If he does, then we fight it, she said. We have what we have. It's more than we had a month ago. He nodded. He looked at the house. He looked back at her. The shutter, he said. I could fix it. She blinked at the change of direction, looked at the house, looked back at him. You've been meaning to fix it since before I got here. I know. What changed? He looked at her with that expression she'd been refusing to analyze for weeks and didn't say anything, and didn't need to. She looked away first. She looked at the ridge. Fix the shutter, she said. Then come eat. It's getting cold. The shutter stopped knocking that evening. She noticed it the way you notice the absence of something that's been constant, a small silence where there used to be sound, the house settling into a slightly different version of itself. She was washing the dinner dishes when it stopped, and she stood at the basin for a moment just registering the quiet. And then she dried her hands and went back to the table where the loan documents and Farr's letter and Aldous Webb's survey comparison were laid out in the order she'd been working through them for the 4th time that week. She was still at the table when Gideon came back inside. He didn't say anything about the shutter, neither did she. What they did instead was spend 2 hours going through the legal package together, which was perhaps the least romantic way two people had ever spent an evening, and which was, she thought, also one of the most honest. He caught a cross-reference error she'd made in the cover letter, a page number from Farr's letter that she'd written as 14 when it was 41, transposed in some moment of tiredness. And she fixed it without defensiveness, and he moved on to the next page without comment, and that small exchange felt like something she'd have been hard-pressed to put into words, but which she understood in her chest with complete clarity. The letter went to Cheyenne again the next morning, corrected, with an additional note to Theodore Crane explaining the timeline they were working against and asking plainly for his assessment of the case's viability before the loan window closed. Then they waited. Waiting was not something Mara was constitutionally suited to. She managed it by working, which was what she always did with anything she couldn't immediately act on. She put her hands on a problem and pushed until either the problem moved or she understood which direction it was going to move on its own. She spent the waiting days on the waterline's weakest sections, reinforcing the joints that Peters had flagged as approximate, clearing the drainage around the distribution box before the ground froze hard enough to make the work impossible. Eli worked beside her for most of it, and she noticed, not for the first time, how much he'd changed in the 8 weeks since the auction. He was still 12, but the 12 he was now was different from the 12 he'd been standing on that platform in his dead father's coat, trying to keep his chin level. This 12 had calluses on his hands and could assess a fence line at a glance, and had an established relationship with a horse that had previously bitten strangers and now permitted Eli to approach from any direction without incident. This 12 went quiet when things were hard and came back to himself after a while and kept going, which was a quality she recognized as something their father had also had before the years had worn it down. She thought about her father more during the waiting days than she had since the first week, partly because the waiting gave her mind room to go places it didn't go when she was moving, partly because she kept encountering the shape of him in things, in the way she read documents, which he'd taught her, in the way she talked to people, which she'd developed in reaction to the way he'd talked to people, in the oversized boots on her feet that she still hadn't replaced because she kept not getting around to it, and also, she suspected, because she wasn't ready to. She thought about what Vane had said. Your father was a stubborn man. She'd said yes because it was true, but she'd thought about it since. Her father's stubbornness had been the quiet kind, the kind that held its ground by refusing to acknowledge that the ground might shift. He'd believed in arrangements because believing in arrangements felt like trust, and trust was a thing he valued so much that he extended it to people who'd long since stopped deserving it. Harlan Geddes had told him the extension was as good as approved, and her father had believed him because he needed to believe something, and because it was easier than sitting with the alternative. She'd spent a lot of time being angry at him for that. She was less angry now. She understood it differently. Not as weakness exactly, but as a particular kind of exhaustion that she recognized in herself on hard days, the desire to accept a reassurance because the work of not accepting it was more than you had left in you. Her father had run out of capacity for doubt somewhere around the 3rd year of declining health and accumulating debt, and Geddes had known exactly when that was and exactly what to offer him. That was the thing about people like Geddes and Vane. They weren't remarkable. They weren't even especially cruel in any complicated way. They were simply people who had learned that other people's exhaustion was a resource, and who had built their operations on harvesting it. Theodore Crane's letter arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days before the loan window closed. She read it in the yard where the courier handed it to her, and she stood in the cold November air and read it twice, and then went inside to find Gideon. He was in the back room going over the cattle count for the Heller contract renegotiation. Since the billing discrepancy, he'd terminated the contracted arrangement and was working through what a new structure might look like with a different partner. He looked up when she came in and read her face before she said anything. She handed him the letter. Crane was a direct writer, which she appreciated. He'd reviewed the survey documentation, Farr's letter, Aldous Webb's professional comparison, and the original filing numbers from the Territorial Land Office records that Aldous had copied. His assessment was that the discrepancy was real, documentable, and significant. His further assessment was that pursuing a formal legal challenge to the 1869 filing would be a lengthy and expensive process with an uncertain outcome, because 40-year-old frauds were difficult to prosecute even with good evidence, and because Silas Vane would have the resources to contest every step. What he also said, and this was the part she'd read twice, was that the value of the documentation was not primarily in what it could prove in a courtroom. It was in what it demonstrated to anyone in a position of county or territorial authority who was weighing their relationship with Silas Vane against other considerations. A man who could be shown to have built his water rights on a falsified survey was a man with a specific kind of vulnerability, and that vulnerability had uses outside a formal legal proceeding. He said he was willing to represent the interests of the Catlet Valley Water Agreement parties in any proceedings that arose, contingent on a retainer that she noted with a sinking feeling before reading his next line, which was that given the circumstances Edmund Farr had described, he was prepared to defer the retainer against any eventual settlement. She looked up from the letter. Gideon had finished reading. He set it on the table. "He's saying we can't necessarily win in court," she said. "He's saying we don't have to. Not if Vane decides the exposure isn't worth it." "Is that what you think Vane decides?" She thought about the yard, the North Road, the way Vane had looked at the ridge from his horse, not with the hungry forward look of a man who wanted something he didn't have, but with the specific quality of a man reassessing the cost of something he'd assumed was already his. "I think he came here himself for a reason," she said. "Men like Vane send people. They don't come personally unless they're taking something seriously, or unless they want to see the person they're dealing with." "Same thing," she said. "Either way, he came because he's taking this seriously." She picked the letter up again. "Crane is right that a legal challenge takes years. We don't have years, we have 11 days. She looked at Gideon. "I need to go back to Red Hollow." "To Vane." "To Owen Marsh first." She'd been thinking about Marsh since the meeting in his office, the way he'd looked at his desk when she mentioned the auction, the specific quality of a man who knew something weighed against him and hadn't decided yet what to do about it. If Marsh takes the survey documentation to the full county board before Vane can shut it down, Marsh doesn't move without cover. He has cover now. He has a licensed surveyor's professional assessment and a lawyer in Cheyenne who's agreed to represent the case. She set the letter down. That's different from a 21-year-old woman with a dead father's letter and an argument. Gideon looked at her, something in his face that she'd stopped pretending she didn't notice. "When do you want to go?" "Tomorrow," she said. "I want you to come." He nodded once. They rode into Red Hollow the next morning with Crane's letter and Aldous Webb's survey comparison in her saddlebag, and the specific quality of purpose that she'd learned over the past weeks felt different in the body from urgency. Urgency was reactive, scattered at the edges. Purpose had a center. She'd found hers somewhere on the ridge in the cold, and it hadn't left. Owen Marsh's office was exactly as she'd left it. He looked up when she came in, and the expression arrangement he attempted was less successful than the first time. She put the documents on his desk without preamble. He read. She stood. Gideon stayed near the door. It took Marsh 7 minutes to read what she'd given him, and she watched his face move through several positions during those 7 minutes. And what she saw was not a corrupt man and not a righteous one, but something more ordinary than either. A man who had been choosing the easiest available path for a long time, and who was now holding a document that made that path difficult in a new way. "This is a serious accusation," he said when he finished. "It's a documented discrepancy in a filed survey," she said. "What it accuses anyone of is a separate question. If this goes to the full board—" "I'd like it to go to the full board," she said. "The water agreements are on file. The survey comparison is signed by a licensed professional. A lawyer in Cheyenne has reviewed the package and is prepared to represent the case." She looked at him. "The board going on record about whether they've reviewed this information is a protection for them, Mr. Marsh, not a risk. The risk is in not reviewing it." Marsh was quiet. He looked at the survey comparison. He looked at Crane's letter, which she'd included. "Vane will contest it," he said. He may. He may also decide that contesting a documented survey discrepancy in a public proceeding is not in his interest." She let that sit. "I don't know which he decides, but I know that the board reviewing the documentation is the right thing to do, and I think you know it too." He looked up at her, looked at her for a longer moment than he had the first time. "I'll call a session," he said. "End of the week." She was almost out the door when he said, quietly, "I should have said something at the auction." She turned. "I know I should have," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the letter. "I told myself it wasn't my place, that it was a bank matter." He stopped. She considered what to say. She thought about her father and about the way she'd stopped being purely angry at him, and about the specific kind of exhaustion that made people accept things they shouldn't. "You're saying something now," she said. "That matters." It was not absolution. She didn't have absolution to give him, and she wouldn't have given it if she had. But it was true. And she'd decided some time ago that true was what she had to offer people in place of the things she couldn't give them. They were a block from the stable when one of Vane's men fell into step beside them. Not the same three from before, a different one, older, with the bearing of someone senior in whatever hierarchy Vane maintained around himself. "Mr. Vane would like a word," he said. Not threatening, almost apologetic. She looked at Gideon. He looked back at her. "Where?" she said. Vane was at the hotel. Not the good one. There wasn't a good one in Red Hollow, but the one that was better than the other. He was in a private room off the dining area, and when she and Gideon came in, he was sitting at a table with 2 glasses already poured, which she read as deliberate. A man who pours 2 glasses before the other people arrive is a man who has decided on the tone of the meeting before the meeting starts. She sat. Gideon stood behind and to the side of her, which was where he'd positioned himself in every room they'd entered together over the past several weeks. And she'd never asked him to do this, and he'd never explained it, and they'd never discussed it, because some things between people don't need a conversation. Vane looked at her without looking at the glasses. "You've been to see Marsh?" "Yes." "He'll call a session." "He said he would?" Vane was quiet for a moment. He had his hands on the table, not folded, flat, in the specific posture of a man who is trying to look relaxed and is working at it. "What you've found in those records," he said. "Delacourt was a careful man." "Careful about some things," she said. "He absorbed this. What happened in 1869 was a different time. The territory was different. The way land was settled—" "Mr. Vane," she kept her voice even. "I'm not here to debate what was normal in 1869. I'm here because the water agreements for 6 families are on file, and the loan on this property has 10 days left on its legitimate window, and I need to know what you're going to do." He looked at her for a long moment. "What if I paid the loan?" She went very still. "The full outstanding balance," he said, "paid to First Territorial, which would clear the note on Cross's property, in exchange for—" "No," she said. He stopped. "Not in exchange for anything," she said. "The loan gets paid, or it doesn't. It doesn't get paid in exchange for the water agreements, or for our silence about the survey, or for any arrangement that puts you in a position to collect on what you're paying now." She held his gaze. "If you want to pay the loan because it's what a man does when he acknowledges he's been operating on something that isn't his, then that's a different conversation." Vane looked at his hands. He looked at the 2 untouched glasses. He looked at some point in the middle distance that had whatever he was working through in it. She waited. She'd learned that waiting, when it was chosen rather than forced, was its own kind of authority. "There's a drainage easement on the Durnan parcel," he said finally, "the one I bought in 1872. If the survey is corrected, that easement affects 3 of my active grazing leases." "I know." "It would require renegotiating those leases." "Probably." "With people who have reason to drive a hard bargain." "Yes." She paused. "The Cabreras and the Wainwrights are reasonable people. So is Preston Cole. What they want is fair terms, not revenge." She looked at him. "That's been true the whole time. Nobody built the water line to destroy you. They built it because they needed water, and you were the only one who'd ever controlled it." Something crossed Vane's face, something she hadn't seen there before. Not remorse exactly, but its older, more weathered cousin. The look of a man encountering the accumulated weight of a pattern he'd been inside so long he'd stopped seeing the shape of it. "The loan," he said. "I'll have Geddes clear it by the end of the week." She watched him. "And the water agreements." "Will stand." He said it like a man putting something down. "I won't contest them." "And the survey." "That—" He stopped, started again. "That process can go wherever it goes. I won't obstruct it." She looked at him for a long moment. She was looking for the angle, the old habit, reading the space between what people said and what they meant. She found something she hadn't expected, which was that there wasn't a significant gap. He was tired. She could see it now that she was looking. The specific exhaustion of a man who had spent decades maintaining a position that required the ongoing suppression of the people around him, which was its own kind of work, unrelenting and thankless in the way that all work is thankless when its product is something you can never publicly claim. "All right," she said. She stood. Gideon was already at the door. "Miss Ellison," Vane said. She looked back. I'm not a monster, he said. It came out more plainly than he probably intended, almost like a question. She thought about her father, about the horses taken in the night, about Eli's face on the auction platform, about 6 families and a water line built in a storm, and a lawyer in Cheyenne, and a shutter that had been knocking for 6 years and was finally quiet. You're a man who made choices, she said. You can make different ones. She walked out into the cold afternoon and Gideon fell into step beside her, and neither of them spoke for a while. Because there are moments where the weight of what just happened requires some time to settle before you can put words on top of it. They were almost to the stable when he said quietly, "You didn't take the easy answer. Paying the loan in exchange for our silence. That would have solved the immediate problem. It would have made us the same as everyone else who took a deal from him and called it settled," she said. "And then in 5 years some other family would be on an auction platform and someone would know we'd had the chance to end it, and hadn't." He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. Harlan Geddes cleared the loan on a Friday, 4 days before the window closed, and Mara was not present for this because she had specifically chosen not to be. She found out from Gideon, who rode into Red Hollow and back in a single day and returned with the release documentation and set it on the kitchen table and sat down and looked at it for a moment, in the particular way of someone who is looking at a thing they didn't fully believe they'd see. She sat across from him. She looked at the document. She thought about the first time she'd sat across a table from a man with papers and how that had gone, and how different this was, and how the difference had been made not by luck or by someone powerful deciding to help, but by work. Her work. And Gideon's. And Aldous Webb's careful measurements, and Rosa Cabrera's 4 names, and Curtis Wainwright's 12-hour days with a post driver, and Eli's cold early mornings, and Peter's with his approximate materials that held. "It's done," Gideon said. "This part," she said. He looked at her. "The survey process will take time," she said. "The lease renegotiations with Vane will take time. Owen Marsh's county board session is next week, and we don't know yet what comes of it." She looked at the document. "This part is done." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you always do that?" "Do what?" "List the things that aren't finished when something finishes." She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "Probably." "Why?" She thought about that too. Because the things that aren't finished don't stop existing just because something else did. She looked up at him. "My father used to celebrate too early. He'd get one thing settled and he'd act like all of it was settled, and then the next thing would come and he wasn't ready." "You're always ready." "I'm always trying to be." She paused. "It's not the same thing." He looked at her with the expression she'd stopped refusing to name. Not in this moment, in the quiet of the kitchen with the document on the table and the shutter silent outside and the ridge visible through the window, the catlit spring up there doing its unremarkable work of running downhill. "Mara," he said. "I know," she said. It was not a romantic declaration. It was 2 people acknowledging something they'd both understood for a while, in the particular way of people who are too practical and too careful and too aware of what's at stake to do it any other way. She thought later that this was exactly right for both of them, that if either of them had wanted something performed, they'd have looked elsewhere and found it, and the fact that they were both here at this table meant they'd both wanted something real instead. Owen Marsh called the county board session the following Tuesday, and she was there with Gideon and Aldous Webb and Theodore Crane, who had come from Cheyenne at his own expense, and who turned out to be a thin young man with a good suit and the specific quality of controlled energy that she recognized as competence in its early stages. Vane was also there. He came alone, which was again the thing that surprised people, and he sat in the session with the bearing of a man who had decided how he was going to handle this and was handling it. He did not contest the survey documentation. He did not challenge the water agreements. When the board asked him directly whether he intended to oppose the Catlet Valley water sharing arrangement, he said no. The room did something. Not a gasp? People in that room were too composed for gasps. But a collective shift in atmosphere, a recalibration, the specific quality of air in a space where something everyone expected to be a fight turns out not to be one. Crane filed the survey discrepancy with the Territorial Land Office the following week. The formal process for correcting a historical filing would take the better part of a year, as he'd predicted. But filing it was the thing. putting it on record that the discrepancy existed, that it had been professionally documented, that it was now part of the territory's land record in a way that anyone looking at Vane's holdings would encounter. That was the weight that shifted. Not a courtroom verdict, but a permanent notation in the public record, which was in some ways more durable. Geddes left First Territorial Bank by the end of that year. She didn't know the details and didn't pursue them. Some things resolved in ways that weren't visible from where you were standing, and trying to track every thread of a thing that was finally moving in the right direction was how you exhausted yourself past the point of usefulness. The winter was hard, the way Wyoming winters are, the kind that doesn't negotiate. She and Gideon and Eli worked through it in the specific rhythm of people who've found a sustainable pace, which is different from an easy pace and better than one. There were hard days and days where things broke, and a week in January where the upper water line froze and had to be thawed in sections, which took 3 days of work she hadn't budgeted for. There was a night when Eli got sick enough that she sat up with him until 3 in the morning and was frightened in the particular helpless way you're frightened when someone you love is in pain you can't fix fast enough. And Gideon sat up too without being asked, making tea. She wasn't sure was medicinal and not saying much, just being there, which was the right thing. Eli recovered. He always did, with the resilience of young people who haven't yet learned that their bodies are supposed to be fragile. Spring came the way spring comes in that country. Slowly, and then suddenly, like a decision finally made after a long time of sitting with it. The water line ran clear. The cattle came down from winter pasture in acceptable condition. The Cabreras put in a kitchen garden on the south side of their house, using the gravity-fed line from the distribution box. The first year Rosa Cabrera had been able to count on reliable water for growing things, and she sent Mara a jar of the first tomatoes put up, which Mara accepted and did not know exactly what to do with emotionally, so she put it on the kitchen shelf where she could see it. The county formally corrected the Vane survey record in late spring. The process was exactly as technical and undramatic as Crane had predicted. A notation, a revised filing, some correspondence between offices. Not a moment of cinematic justice. Just a correction to a number in a ledger, which was how most of the important things turned out to work. Vane renegotiated his grazing leases with the Cabreras and the Wainwrights and Preston Cole. She wasn't in those negotiations. She'd made it clear from the beginning that she had no interest in being in them, that what she'd wanted was for the people who'd been wronged to have the position to negotiate fairly, not to have someone negotiate for them. Rosa Cabrera reported afterward that the terms were reasonable and that Vane had been, if not warm, at least straight about what he was offering, which Rosa said was more than she'd expected and probably about what the situation had made available. That was how the valley changed, not dramatically, not all at once. The way most things actually change, in increments, in renegotiations, in decisions made in rooms by people who'd recalculated what was possible based on evidence that hadn't existed the year before. She was standing at the south fence line on a May evening, checking the posts she'd repaired in her first week. They'd held through the winter, solid, when Eli came out from the barn and stood beside her. He was 13 now, and the 13 was different from the 12 in ways she was still mapping. Peter said there's good work up in Montana, he said, for a man who knows horses. She looked at him. I'm not going, he said quickly. I'm just saying, Peter said. I know you're not going. She looked back at the fence. In a few years, if you want to. I don't want to go somewhere else, he said. It came out more direct than he probably intended, the way things do when you're 13 and haven't learned to modulate yet. I want to stay here. Is that? He stopped. She put her arm around his shoulders briefly. He was almost as tall as she was. Yes, she said. That's all right. He nodded. He went back to the barn. She stayed at the fence. She thought about what belonging meant, how she'd spent her whole life up to the auction platform thinking it was something you were born into, something that existed in a deed with your family name on it, something that could be taken. The ranch her father had built, the land her name was attached to, the home that had been seized for a debt she hadn't made. She'd been wrong about what belonging was. She understood that now, in the particular way you understand things that you had to lose in order to see. Belonging wasn't the deed, it wasn't the name on the paper. It was the south fence you'd repaired yourself, The posts you knew by which ones had been stubborn and which had gone in clean. It was the water line you'd built in a storm. It was the ledgers you'd read and the letters you'd written and the people who'd shown up at first light because you'd asked them to. It was the jar of tomatoes on the kitchen shelf and the shutter that didn't knock anymore, and a 12-year-old boy who'd become a 13-year-old who wanted to stay. You couldn't be sold out of that. Nobody had a deed to it. Gideon came across the yard as the light was going. He stopped beside her. "Fence looks good," he said. "I told you it would hold." "You told me that in October." "I was right in October." He stood beside her, and they both looked at the fence that had held and the pasture beyond it, going gold in the May evening light, and the ridge above, and the country past the ridge that she still hadn't seen all of, and had a reasonable expectation now of seeing at her own pace. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" He was quiet in the particular way that meant he was choosing words carefully. "About whether you'd consider making the arrangement we have something more official." She looked at him. He had the specific expression of a man who has planned something and is discovering that the plan and the moment are two different things. "I'm not doing this well," he said. "You're doing it fine." "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not because of the ranch, not because of any of it. I'd like you to stay because—" He stopped again, looked at the fence. "I've been alone a long time. I thought I'd gotten used to it. Turns out I was just used to it, which is different." She knew it was different. She'd spent 8 months learning the distance between those two things. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "That's not quite—" "Gideon." She turned to look at him. "I know what you're asking, and I know what I want. And I'm telling you I'm not going anywhere, which is my way of saying yes without making you finish a sentence you're clearly struggling with." He looked at her. Something came into his face that she hadn't seen before. Not relief, because he'd had enough control over his expectations not to have needed relief. Something quieter than that. Something that had been waiting a long time to be allowed out. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They stood at the south fence in the May evening, and the light kept going the way light does, indifferent to the people standing in it, and she thought about what she would have said if someone had told her, on the day she stood on that auction platform, that this was where she'd be 8 months later. She would not have believed them. Not because it was too good, but because she couldn't have imagined standing there in her father's boots with 40 people looking at their feet, that she had the capacity to build something like this. Not just the ranch, not just the water line, not just the legal documentation that had shifted what was possible in this valley. This. The fence that held, the brother who wanted to stay, the man standing beside her who had been alone too long and had spent $1,500 at an auction because he couldn't watch it happen. She'd had nothing. She'd been on a platform with no deed, no money, no name worth anything in that town. She'd walked off that platform with what she'd come onto it with, which was exactly herself. Her father's stubbornness and her mother's stillness and her own hard-acquired ability to read what was real when everything official said otherwise. She'd built from that. Only from that. And there was something she'd understood, somewhere between the frozen water line in January and the south fence in May, that she thought was the truest thing she'd found in a year of finding hard, true things. That what you had to build with was never the materials. It was the decision to build. The decision made again every morning, including the mornings when you were tired and the pipe was frozen and the money was short and you couldn't quite see how the next step led to the step after. Other people's belief in your limitations is only as powerful as your willingness to share it. She had stopped sharing it somewhere on the auction platform, standing in her dead father's boots, listening to a man say the girl in a flat voice, feeling something in her chest turn from water to stone. She'd been building from stone ever since. The last light left the ridge and the valley went blue and quiet, and somewhere up in the dark of the catlit country, the spring ran the way it always ran, indifferent and essential, finding its way downhill through the dark to the places where people had decided, together, to receive it. She stayed at the fence a moment longer. Then she turned toward the house, toward the lit kitchen window, toward the jar of tomatoes on the shelf, and whatever was left on the stove and the documents on the table that still needed finishing, because there were always documents that still needed finishing, and that was all right. That was all right. She walked toward the light.